Hi there, Shelby here. Welcome to the first video on my channel. If you enjoy commentary, lifestyle, and general musings, then stay tuned. This first one is pretty near and dear to something that I had as a hobby for a really long time. And disclaimer, this all is just my opinion. It's educational, a little fun and entertaining at the same time, and it leaves you with some interesting questions, not only about the cosplay community, but at overconsumption and greedflation and all of these societal things that have ripple effects on the creativity community as a whole. So let's get into it. I'm going to pontificate, if you will, about how the cosplaying community went from an entertainment-based subculture to a capitalistic rat race. It's made me think a lot on how the barrier to entry has increased as inflation rises and down-to-earth novice creators get lost to others with more money and influence. And more importantly, where that leaves aspiring cosplayers and future creative people at large for the future wanting to get into this hobby. Now again, another disclaimer, no, we gotta have a lot of them. This is not meant to shade anyone who is a current cosplayer or enjoys the hobby. This is merely just my observation and an exploration, if you will, of its changes over time and how this has implications on the cosplay community as a whole. Now, for real, let's get into it. Part 1, how it started. What video essay would this be if we didn't have a definition of cosplaying? Merriam-Webster cites it as the activity or practice of dressing up as a character from a work of fiction, such as a comic book, video game, or television show. Now, cosplay, a fusion of the words costume play, has gained a rapid popularity since its humble beginnings in decades past. You might be surprised to know that the first cosplayers actually weren't from Japan, but New York City in 1939. Cosplay pioneer Myrtle Rebecca Douglas Smith Gray Nolan, known in the sci-fi world as Morojo, her and her boyfriend at the time, Ackerman, attended the first World Science Fiction Convention in New York City in what was called futurista costumes. Their attire was based on the pulp magazine artwork of Frank R. Paul and 1936 film Things to Come. Now, in true OG cosplay fashion, Morojo designed, created, and sewed the costumes herself. It set the tone for every year after, where everyone began parading and performing skits on stage. From there, the term cosplay was coined by Nobuyuki Takahashi from manga studio Hard and began using it in magazines in the early 1980s after attending Worldcon in LA. So the performance art, the excitement, the act of cosplaying was born. Part 2, how it gained popularity. I'm part of the generation who saw Sailor Moon when it first came on TV in the US in the early to mid-90s. Although some anime made it to the Western world in the 80s, it was considered obscure to my understanding and didn't start becoming as popular or readily available until the late 90s, with Toonami being many millennials' gateway into titular titles such as Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, Cardcaptor Sakura, or Cardcaptors, and Rurouni Kenshin, to name but a few. Capitalism was starting to catch up. VHSs made their way into Toys R Us end caps. Dolls and action figures began slowly filling shelves as demand rose. But here's the kicker. Something younger people today might not really believe or understand from vicarious experience. You were considered nerdy or a huge dork for liking anime back then. In fact, I saw kids who were mercilessly teased for drawing in an anime style and wearing cat ears and tails in school. It wasn't nearly as ubiquitous or understood in the US as it is now, where you can buy DBZ Adidas and go to the theater to watch the latest Demon Slayer movie. This still shocks me a little bit to this day as a millennial, just to know that this is so accessible. Anime was still very much a subculture at the time that we're talking about that other people just didn't understand. It was that weird Japanese stuff to a lot of parents. Although anime releases made it to US theaters as early as the 1960s, I even remember how big of a deal it was when titles such as Spirited Away and Appleseed made it to theaters during my childhood. That was when it slowly started becoming part of the larger pop culture lexicon. Now, you may be wondering, what does that have to do with cosplay? Well, if you were a kid in the 1990s to 2000s and you wanted to dress up like your favorite anime character, you had to do it all yourself. There were no Art of Wigs or cosplay sites selling ready-to-buy outfits. In fact, the internet was still in its infancy compared to how we use it today. Part of what brought the cosplay community together was its ability to craft and to create things from scratch. Now, before you get upset, I'm not trying to say anyone who buys a costume today is any less of a cosplayer than someone who makes it from scratch. Quite the contrary, really. But in those early days, if you wanted a costume, you had to either make it yourself or know someone who could sew and help you do it. I was the latter. Thank you to everyone in the past who always helped me cosplay and have such a fun time. It means the world to me even today to look back on some of those memories. It could have been a friend, a mom, or even your local seamstress. I took time to paint this picture for you because, like its very name, costuming is at the grassroots of the cosplay community as a whole. Now, that may sound obvious, but people who attended conventions and learned completely new skill sets to come to life as their favorite character. This felt like a fundamental core principle of the subculture. There was a labor of love in looking at every detail of a character and putting it into your costume and finding out how you could retrofit things at Joann Fabrics to make that costume work and make it look good. I can still remember the double-sided bias tape that we had to do in so many uniform-based cosplays back in the day. That stuff was so annoying, and this is someone who is not crafty, so kudos to all of you who can still use double-sided bias tape to this day. For those of you unfamiliar with how anime conventions and other weekend Comic-Con events work, many host main events. There's a whole room typically that covers main events or like big guests, major events with screens where you can watch things. Many host costume contests where a panel of judges evaluate costumes based on categories like Best in Show, Best Group, Judges Award, Best Craftsmanship, and even other levels of skill. So there's some that are like Novice, Journeyman, and Master awards. There's also a section of this separate from the costume contest, or kind of an accoutrement, if you will. That's a skits portion, where people can mix their own sound clips or music and do a performance in costume. They can do this solo or with a group. It can be danced or scripted or not. I personally have done a few of these before, and they're quite fun. They are nerve-wracking. A huge part of cosplaying that's enjoyable is people emulating the mannerisms, personality, and general vibe of the character they're dressing up as. So the skits portion feels like a very vital complement to just the costuming aspect of it, or like an additional component. I gotta take a sip of water. Nowadays, companies like the World Cosplay Showcase exist, where people travel and compete worldwide to win huge prizes. They've been held in Spain, South Korea, and China, to name a few. Now, as anime became more accessible, thanks to manga being published in the Western world, online streaming, and it being really thrust into the mainstream as a result, talented crafters from all over travel for yearly conventions such as Dragon Con, New York City Comic Con, MetroCon, KatsuCon, to showcase costumes, spend time with friends, enter contests, and buy merchandise from artists and other vendors. Was even AFO, and in my 2000s years in its beginnings, it was literally called Hallway Con because all you had to do was just show up in your costume and you didn't need a pass to get into everything. There was a long hallway of the old hotel and people would just show up and sit in the hallways and talk and get food and laugh and play games and take photos. This is a fundamental piece of what I mean when I'm circling it back to accessibility, so keep that in mind for later when I bring this up. As someone who used to regularly plan my vacations and travel to conventions in-state and out, this hobby comes at a huge personal expense. People often save all year in order to gain hotel slots at these venues, to purchase food, and for luggage fees to transport huge props and other costume pieces. Because of this expensive hobby, what happens when that barrier to entry becomes too high? What happens to cosplayers then? And what does it say about us when we value the flashier, fancier costumes over other homegrown ones? What does that mean for the future of cosplaying itself? Part 3. Enter influencer culture. As cosplay continued to gain notoriety, we haven't even gone into how social media has impacted the cosplay community. As platforms such as Instagram and TikTok have taken off, it's grown into an entirely different beast. Enter influencer culture and the hunger of being part of the next big trend. There were, of course, cosplay celebrities before social media became what we know it as today. Yaya Han is the most notable to me personally. I remember attending panels as early as the mid-2000s where she would lead Q&As and teach others about her techniques. I remember her 2004 rendition of Yuna's wedding dress from Final Fantasy X was absolutely dazzling at the time. Those elaborate types of wings had rarely been done before to that quality. Now, she's made it to TV, has her own fabric line at Joanne Fabrics, and has judged probably hundreds of cosplay competitions by now. Jessica Negri's another, starting in 2009 and rocketing to stardom after winning awards for her risque costumes like Juliet in the video game Lollipop Chainsaw. She's also a glamour model and has broken out into voice acting roles, her most famous being Cinder from the RWBY animated series and Super Sonico from Sonicami Communication with Sonico. Those are considered the old guard, of course, and now there are thousands of cosplayers who enter contests and craft. Some even seek to gain a career out of it and an extra source of income for brand deals, cosplay guest appearances, and more. Now to that I say, get your bag, sis. But I've seen cosplayers whose entire heart and souls were around getting details right and not always going for the flashiest costume. Some even get snubbed for winning craftsmanship awards on fabric alone. Over the years, I've noticed from my limited perspective as a non-seamstress, but who had very close relationships with people who had that as their hobby and regularly sewed for enjoyment outside of cosplay and inside of cosplay. But there was a cattiness I would see occasionally develop around what constitutes the best costume. I've worked contests, I've seen it at conventions all over the country, and this bombastic side-eye does happen sometimes. I'm not saying it's all the time, but it can happen. Now, what can you say with showbiz and theater and any kind of adjacent hobby? There's gonna be drama, but I more present this angle and repeat the fundamental question here. What made the cosplay community what it was in the first place? Have we strayed too far? Are we evolving, or are we going away from what made it the precious thing that it was? I don't have an answer, I'm curious what you guys think. The original cosplay community as I remember it in convention culture as a whole, at least in the anime lens, I wasn't as much in the comic side of things, but that wasn't about winning prizes or coming out on top. There were still many people, and today, I don't want to discount the many people who simply get costumes to have a fun weekend partying and spending time with friends, and even getting some fire photo shoots, because that is absolutely a part of what makes conventions fun, right? I'm not saying those things still don't happen, and don't happen in addition to everything else that you do with contests. I know quite a few people who enter contests regularly as a hobby and also partake in all the other aspects of what conventions have to offer. I feel like the community seems to be shifting away from being this safe space for everyone and more of an exclusive space where you're only accepted when you have a certain level of costume acumen under your belt, or should I say, a certain level of credibility attributed to you. To that I say, how will novices grow if we continue gatekeeping contests or costumes based on how flashy they look? I understand that's why novice level awards exist, but I'm also speaking to the general environment being one of safety, acceptance, and inclusivity. As it gets more mainstream, are we compromising those grassroots values? What do you think? I know a lot of people with the 90s and 2000s fashion coming back around, they wish they lived during that time, and as someone who did grow up during those decades, I can tell you inclusivity was not something that was at the top of the list. So as TikTok audios speed by and kids feel pressure to buy at Sephora and conform, I question what effect this will have on the cosplay community. I've noticed the gradual decline. The capitalistic rat race has attached itself to this subculture in a multitude of ways. Weekend pass prices have risen exponentially, like most things, sometimes being more than $100 for the weekend for large-scale conventions. Scandals like Ball Pit Con and OhioCon more recently sour the opportunity for other events to come back year after year and creates a negative opportunity or negative reputation for other conventions trying to get renewed contracts with hotels and different venue spaces. As contest prizes rise and high-profile guests flock to these spaces, so too do mainstream problems. The insular bubble that once made the cosplay community an intimate space has undoubtedly expanded onto the world stage. And perhaps that isn't a bad thing, and these are the ramblings of a nostalgic person who saw glimpses of what it once was. There's a lot of great things that come out of normalizing cosplay. People get incredible opportunities to create art and connect with others while doing it. I more wonder about the person who thrifted their costume and saved for months to get entry, only to feel alone when they walk the halls and see more elaborate light-up costumes or armor littering the hallways. We all know shit is expensive right now, and with greedflation, we're seeing a return to DIY cosplaying versus buying things online. Friends I've talked to mention how much easier it was years ago to just buy a school uniform cosplay, whereas now we've come full circle into making it yourself as the cheaper option. Will this help us readjust our expectations and barrier to entry of cosplay, or, like society, continue to widen the gap between people who can afford things and people who simply cannot? In my experience, typically, the more popular and or elaborate your costume is, the more attention you'll get in the hallways. People will ask you for photo ops. Somehow, thinking about this, the space for the little guy seems smaller than ever. I mourn how intimidating it must feel to enter that as a novice, a younger person, where judgment of your every move is at an all-time high, and there really is no privacy. You're filmed all the time and scrutinized by everyone. As a young cosplayer, this kind of attention and validation meant everything to me growing up. It made you feel part of something bigger, that you belonged. I can't speak for young people today, but I do know on a macro scale, many Gen Z and Alpha kids are having challenges conforming to spaces that no longer feel welcoming. We don't have tween spaces that allow kids to just be kids. It's difficult to see because everybody's been that preteen kid before who gets let loose at the mall and was able to act stupid and be a kid. For anyone who can't afford the fanciest costume, regardless of age, you deserve to take up space there. You don't have to purchase the most expensive fabric or triple style your wig to be included. You are valid in whatever way you show up to an anime or comic convention. That's my departing message to you. Let me know in the comments if you'd like more videos exploring topics like these. I think in conclusion, we need to let people be bad at things to begin with. Creativity is nurtured and grows, and we get better by doing things. So I just want to give space and honor the next generation of people who might not have the perfect costume the first time. And I know that there are a lot of spaces where this is true, this is very much honored. So I don't want to make this blanket thing that this is how the cosplay community is and it's all toxic and bad. It's not what I mean. It's more on a macro scale, the changes and what implications that they have on the future. So again, thanks for watching. I'm just a girl in her little cutesy room, and I hope that you'll subscribe. Feel free to hit that notification bell to receive alerts for my next video, and be sure you follow me. Thanks, and I'll see you later.